wandering samurais, shogunate loyalties, and a lot of flute playing. Today's book takes us all over 18th century Japan and follows a traveling monk as he makes an odyssey from Nagasaki all the way to Edo. Today, my guest and I will walk this ronin path together on this week's episode of Beyond the Manuscript. But before we get started today, I need to introduce this week's guest. Joining me today is a DC author and here today to talk about his debuting novel, The Song of the Samurai. Available now wherever books are sold. Please help me in welcoming my guest today, Mr. C.A. Parker. How are we doing today, Charlie?
I'm good, Cooper. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here on this show today. It's really fun to, explore the topics of your book when it was pitched to me, and I'm just kind of a big sucker at the moment for anything of pre-war Japan and just the history that it has there. So when someone pitched me your book of a wandering monk who plays the flute and goes on these little mini adventures, I was like, I'm in. I'm totally in for that. So to kind of get us started for today, can you please tell us all about The Song of the Samurai?
Sure. Song of the Samurai takes place in mid-18th century Japan. So it's in the middle of the Tokugawa shogunate. So for listeners of yours who have been fans of Shogun, it takes place about 145 years after that story, but it's the same family that is in power in Japan. And Japan, as I think you know, Cooper, during that period did a lot of self-isolating. So culturally, it will feel very similar to the period that people saw in Shogun.
Yeah. For those of you who may not know, to kind of give reference for what you're talking about there. This is around the time where Japan closed off its pretty much almost its entire borders to every country around the place, except for the city of Nagasaki and I believe it's the Dutch. They were like the only ones allowed to trade in only in this one little area here. And it would stay like that for, just being a foreigner in this country in this time was pretty much illegal.
Right. In fact, the Dutch themselves, although they were the only European trading partners at that point, were themselves confined to a little island, an artificial island that had been created in the middle of Nagasaki harbor. So, and my story starts in Nagasaki because there's a Zen temple there that my protagonist was part of. My protagonist was actually a historical character. He was of samurai class. His name was Kurosawa Kinko, and he joined this relatively obscure sect of Rinzai Buddhism called the Fuke. And whereas most Buddhist practice centers around what they call sitting meditation, zazen, the Fuke practiced a discipline called suizen, which was blowing meditation. And they used this flute, the shakuhachi, as their primary meditation tool. Also, it's just worth noting, since the sect was made up entirely of men of samurai class who were trained to fight, they actually ended up using this flute. They cut it lower and lower on the bamboo shaft so that it ended up with a root ball, and they ended up using it not only as a tool for meditation, but also a weapon.
A good blending of yeah.
Exactly. So so the story starts off with Kinko in Nagasaki, and which was historically where he was. But we don't have much information about the rest of Kinko's life because his journals were destroyed during the firebombing of Tokyo during World War II. So we know where he started his life and we know where he ended his life in Edo, modern day Tokyo. But there's a lot of empty space in between there in which to craft a novel. And that's where my novel takes place. So that the novel itself is entirely fictional, but uses Kurosawa Kinko as the protagonist. And the novel begins with sort of a crisis in his life as he gets evicted from his temple for an affair with a married woman,
Hmm.
and is sent essentially across the country to a different temple to sort of recreate his life.
Hmm.
And it is, as you note, an adventure story with swords and music, but it's also and I think at its root, a redemption story.
Hmm.
It's about Kurosawa coming to understand himself better and uh, set his life right again.
Sure. Absolutely. So with with it's such a fascinating book with so many, like a good blending of historical figures and fiction of your own making. What inspired you to make this kind of book?
I have been playing the shakuhachi flute myself for the last 25 plus years in the school that Kinko founded. So
Oh.
he began a school of flute playing, the Kinkyo Ryu, um, that continues to this day. And I have been playing in the school for over 25 years. So I've known Kinko as a musician and a composer for a long time, and have just always been interested. He was just a fascinating historical character, brilliant musician, and a samurai. And he spent a lot of his life actually traveling around Japan to the different temples in this Zen sect, collecting the music that each temple created.
Mm.
The temples, there were about 77 of them at this point in history. Each had their own piece of music or a couple of pieces of music that their monks played as their meditative practice. And Kinko, under the direction of the sort of mothership of this sect, the Fuke, traveled all over Japan to the different temples, collecting their music, and that collection of musical pieces became the heart of his shakuhachi school.
Mm.
So he's just always been a fascinating character for me, and I when I started thinking about writing about him, I had envisioned honestly a series of mystery novels, since he's
Mm.
traveling to different temples throughout his life, and I sort of in my head envisioned this sort of mystery per temple sort of formula. But that's been done before, and as I started writing, Kinko seemed to want to go in a different direction, and so the story got much deeper
Mm.
and more philosophically complex, and that's how it came to be.
Sure. It's always very interesting when you create a character and you aim them, towards the ending of a book, but they, basically take on a life of their own. They're like, "Nope, I am going over here and I'm going to wander over to this side, and this is what the story is really going to be about." And you, the author, have no choice at that point. You must follow the character that you've created into doing something else. Sure.
Exactly, or it
Yeah.
just starts to sound fake.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like you're guiding a horse rather than letting a character be themselves. For sure.
Yeah,
Awesome. So one of the things you mentioned before is that this kind of does tie into the FX remake of Shogun, where one thing that's really prominent in that, well, not just the book and the time and even the show itself, is like the role of women in this time in society here. And so, for you, can you speak on the women characters and their place in society in mid 18th century Japan?
yeah. There are several important women characters over the course of his journey, and they're intentionally from different classes of Japanese society. Um, the One of the interesting pieces, though, is the ironically the higher class the women were, the less freedom they had,
Hmm.
because they were fairly is a very tightly controlled society. And as you probably know from your history, Cooper, the Tokugawa shogunate, one of the ways they maintained control was to keep the families of the major lords in Edo,
Hmm.
so that the lords may be out in their own province ruling, but their wife and children were often in Edo near the shogun, essentially as hostages.
Hmm.
So that all of the major lords had to maintain two residences, one in Edo, Tokyo, and one wherever their fief was. And the movement of those women were very tightly controlled because the shoguns were very afraid that if a lord was able to spirit his family out of the city,
Hmm.
um, he loses a blackmail lever. And
Yeah.
so the women were the women's movement, the upper class women in particular, which there's one character in the book, were very tightly controlled and monitored and didn't have a lot of freedom.
Hmm.
Um, there are a couple other characters who are from the artisan class. So a couple ranks down from the samurai, where they have a great deal more opportunity to express themselves artistically and how they're living, and they move freely around the country. Um, but those are all themes that if you happen to see the FX Shogun um, series, are very prominent.
Yeah.
The keeping of families as hostages essentially was a very early practice.
Definitely. And going even beyond that aspect of it, where, again, I'm going more over the show here, but during this time where, yes, there's a lot of constrictions on women and their roles in society. But one thing I think that's really brilliant about not just the show, but in the book as well, is that you see women take agency for themselves and learn how to press the soft levers on the men
Yes.
around them to kind of get their own way in a lot of places.
Yes.
And it's really interesting to see, even though you're, like you said, you're putting a lot of constraints and you're controlling a lot of women just in general, they still, through creativity, have the ability to accomplish their own goals. There you go.
Yeah,
That's
and
probably a better way to
sometimes
put it.
wield rather considerable power.
So obviously, so this story takes place, almost a couple hundred years ago here. In your opinion, what makes this story relevant for today?
Well, there are a number of pieces that I think are very pertinent, Cooper. In part because the whole story starts with Kurosawa's life essentially falling apart because
Hmm.
he has made a significant mistake, and he loses a position of status and power in his monastery, and is not excommunicated, but evicted
Evicted
from
from,
the
yeah, yeah,
monastery, and his whole life has fallen apart. And so the central question of the book is, how does he put it back together? And that's a question that all of us wrestle with, when we
hmm,
hit roadblocks in our journeys. And so his journey of self-exploration and meditation and coming to understand himself and his place in the world better is a saga that we all go through in our
sure,
own ways. And so, while it's certainly it's a novel that is set in a very specific time, and I hope richly set in that time. The themes are universal. They're struggles that we all go through, and how we deal with conflict, and how do we center
hmm,
ourselves in the middle of conflict, and how do we redeem ourselves from mistakes that we've made.
sure. So in that kind of note there, how much of this fictionalized version of Kurosawa that's in your book, how much of their life reflects your own life, would you say?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And people are always interested in sort of who inspired this character and who inspired that character. And uh, I found myself, as this story got written, not basing any of the characters on anybody, but pulling bits and pieces from different people that I knew, musicians I've known, my own stories, and incorporating bits and pieces of those throughout the narrative. So there's most of the major characters have their origins in two, three, or four people that I, borrowed bits and pieces of stories and character traits and musical techniques and whatever else.
Sure. Well, speaking of the different disciplines, so your character practices not only the flute but also martial arts as well. And so your opinion, how do the two blend together? Are they conflicting? How does one feed into the other essentially?
That's a good question, Cooper. All of the historically, all of the members of this particular Zen sect were of samurai class. So they were all trained in the martial arts. And in fact, the shogunate used the sect of monks, this particular sect of monks, as a repository for samurai who had lost their lords. So it was a safer place to put a lordless samurai than having them be a ronin and wander the the roads, causing havoc. So so if a samurai lost a lord and found himself unemployed, going into this monastic sect was one of the reasonable options, and then they would often be there just temporarily while they're looking for other lords to serve. So it was not a monastic sense in the way that we often think of them in a Christian context, where people sort of spend their lives in the monastery. There was a class of people who spent most of their lives in the monastery leading it, but for most of the monks themselves, they were sort of in and out, and martial training was part of their monastic discipline. That can sound a little conflicting, a samurai who's also a Zen monk, but I would argue that at the core, in both the monastic tradition and the martial tradition, you're learning techniques that have to do with how you center yourself in the midst of daily life, whether that's somebody swinging a sword at your head, or buying groceries in the supermarket. It's about being present. It's about being centered. It's about um, self-understanding. And martial arts, for people who don't practice martial arts, it is easy to come away with a sense that it's about violence and fighting techniques. But in almost every martial tradition, the more advanced one gets, the more one spends time paying attention to centering your body and your deep in your breath and watching how you move and how you're responding to a situation. And it's a very powerful tool for gaining self-understanding and insight, in the same way that religious practice is.
What's really interesting is that when we're talking about meditation, most people in Western cultures, I would say, tend to focus on just the mind part of meditation. They think of sitting down in a nice quiet place, legs crossed, and they close their eyes and they're just focusing on their breathing in and out.
Right.
When you mix, the thing is, some people also don't realize is that just there is a physical part to meditation that is also possible. Just doing the same kind of physical motions over and over again can be quite meditative. Like I know a lot of people who, let's say, they live out in the woods and they're chopping firewood for hours and hours at a time. It's very physical. It's very physically demanding, but it's also repetitive. Axe comes up, axe comes down, and then you do that 300 more times until you have enough firewood to last you the winter, that kind of thing. So if but and the same thing can kind of be true with martial arts. Where if you practice the same motions over and over and over again, it really helps clear the mind a lot. A lot of times, not just you sitting down and being quiet.
Right, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, that's a good example, Cooper, because what happens if you're chopping wood for 300 strokes is your arms start to feel like they're going to fall off, and you more and more have to make the motion from your core muscles, and you're strengthening your center, and you're focusing on your breathing. And those are all part of what make meditative practice effective.
Hmm.
So it's both, it's the repetitiveness, but it's also the impact it has on your body. But
Hmm.
there are people who practice all kinds of active skills in a meditative way, and you see meditative painters and musicians and photographers and martial artists, and it's the practice of learning how to be present in a moment is not just about sitting; it's about
Hmm.
mindfulness.
Yeah. Be like water, as Bruce Lee would say, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. So one thing that I've started reading your book and I'm already pretty hooked on it. But when I was reading the first opening pages in the acknowledgments, you mentioned there that during the process of writing this book, you were it was dedicated to your late wife, which I find incredibly touching and soothing and everything. But do you want to talk about like the process of writing this book while dealing with something of like losing a spouse?
Sure. You know, Janine gets credit. I mean, I dedicate the book to her and to our two kids because
Mm-hmm.
um, she not only made it possible for me to write this by keeping the family afloat, but but she endured a lot of many years of painful music lessons and is my master trying to master an instrument that's a hard instrument to play, and even if it's played well, um, doesn't appeal to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So she was very patient with me throughout that process, and gave me this wonderful gift of being able to have the time to tell a story. And it ended up quite coincidentally, and tragically on the obvious levels, but also was a wonderful gift that I was able to be home doing this while she was going through her struggle with breast cancer. And one of the very odd blessings of the pandemic was that our kids were also sequestered with us.
Mm-hmm.
So it was incredibly hard and painful for the whole family. And we had this wonderful period where we got to spend time together and enjoy one another and read books and watch movies together. And so it was a wonderful, yeah, I mean, it was a horrible and wonderful time
Mm-hmm.
to, and a wonderful gift to have that.
Sure.
So,
Well, the only reason I even bring it up really is I wanted to showcase to a lot of listeners out there who, when you are writing a book, very rarely is someone writing it alone, right?
mm,
Yes, it's going to be you and nowadays a laptop or handwriting or whoever you actually produce the actual book. That's you by yourself a lot of times. But like I said, very rarely are you going to be done with that. You have life outside of writing the book, and if you get to share that kind of experience and have, and not even just share it, but have someone to lean on while writing it and get feedback and enjoying these moments, I think that's incredibly special. I think that's a wonderful way of not just having an experience, but when writing a book, you get a lovely snapshot of your style and where you are kind of that place in time. And I say there's a lot of over romanticizing being an author today. But there are still plenty of moments that are very harrowing and can be, special, not just to hopefully your readers who are going to go pick up this book, which is available now, by the way. But, you can, uh, you know, share a moment that you can then just say, hey, this was a moment in our life and this is the product of it that I get to share with the world.
yeah, I mean, whenever you're drawing or whenever you're writing, you're drawing on the emotional content that you're experiencing. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and again, just like you have to be faithful to where your character's leading, you have to find ways of expressing, the grief, the frustration, all of the pieces that are part of that journey.
Mm-hmm.
You also mentioned appropriately, and I don't know that I was aware of this before I started writing this debut novel, is how important some of those outside readers are very
Mm-hmm.
early in the process. it's pretty traditional for authors, new and experienced, to grab a couple of what they call beta readers to
Hmm.
go through the text and give you really detailed and hopefully honest and direct feedback on what's working and what's not.
Yeah.
And I was very blessed with four amazing beta readers, two of whom were um, incredibly helpful with the content. One is one of the world's great shakuhachi masters, who knows a great deal about the history as well as the technique of the instrument, and an amazing woman who's a Japanese ethnomusicologist who also helped with a lot of the technical content pieces. I had another wonderful friend who's a English professor who went through this thing with the prototypical English red pen and sort of did all the correcting and
Sure.
pointing out all the places that the language can be tightened up, and then another dear friend who's just a voracious reader. And getting that kind of feedback early on in the process before you even start shipping the manuscript out to agents and publishers is so important to come up with a quality product.
Absolutely. Sure. So, in that same kind of sense, are there more chapters with Kurosawa Kinko like that you want to write in the future?
Yeah, this story takes place over the course of 1 year,
Mm,
and in my head, there it is a standalone book, but it is also in my head potentially the first book in a trilogy
mm.
that follows his adult life, and I think part of what will determine whether those come out, Cooper, is how well this sells, if there's a market for it.
Definitely. Well, I think if the numbers for the Shogun series that just came out, there's definitely a market for well-written, like early 18th or sorry, mid 18th century Japan stories out there, I think.
I hope so. I think so too. It's a fascinating period of history, and I do think there's enough cultural awareness that and interest that people will gravitate towards it.
Mhm. All right. Well, we are running out of time here for today. So, to kind of wrap things up here, I want to thank my guest, C.A. Parker, for coming on the show. This episode of Beyond the Manuscripts, which of course is powered by manuscripts where you never write alone. Please go pick up your copy of The Song of the Samurai. The link is, of course, in the description below, but of course, it's available on Amazon and everywhere else where books are sold. Charlie, thank you again so much for being a guest.
Thank you, Cooper. It was great fun.